Hello, everyone. Welcome again to Freedom First, the podcast where we talk about political and economic ideas that shape the economic freedom of Filipinos. I'm Jam,
And I'm Cesar.
and today we're joined by Attorney Bob Herrera-Lim. So, Bob is a managing director at Ateneo and a seasoned political analyst. Bob has been covering political and business risk across Southeast Asia, including Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and many more, since 2002. He has written extensively on topics such as conflict, risk, and democracy, and he brings deep regional expertise to today's conversation.
Now, before we get started, we'd like to thank the Institute of Economic Affairs London and the Whetstone Freedom Fund for sponsoring today's video. IEA is an organization that supports global advocates for free market solutions, and we're proud to partner with them in spreading ideas of liberty. So please make sure to follow us at the Foundation for Economic Freedom on YouTube, Spotify, and Facebook for the releases of these episodes. Now, in today's episode, we're talking to Bob about democracy and liberal democracy, two political concepts that we often use interchangeably and are now facing growing challenges both domestically and globally. We are excited to explore the tensions inherent in democracy and what liberal democracy means for us Filipinos in the face of these pressing questions.
Let's start at the very beginning. What is democracy really?
Okay, if you take a look at the textbooks, you'll find lots of definitions. But for me, democracy has two or three, maybe four essential characteristics at most. The first is people are equal in politics, in the political space. You do not have more rights than me. You do not have more powers than me as an individual. Okay, that's the first thing. We are equal politically. Doesn't mean we're equal economically. It means we are treated the same, regardless of where we came from, how we look, what we do, or shall we say, what our beliefs are. The second is we are all free. Okay, so constraints on our behavior, on what we can do, must be reasonable and justified. But generally, the rule is it must be with basis. No one can just arbitrarily say, you are not allowed to go in the case of, to Mindanao, or you are not allowed to go to Thailand, right? If you want to travel, you are free to travel. So there are individual freedoms on what you can do. The third is there is rule by the majority. So a key concept of democracy is the society, the people decide for themselves. And normally that is majority rule expressed through elections. And indirectly, once you have elected people who run the country, through what we call representative democracy. So basically, those are like the three or four ideas around democracy. It is people are equal. The system is run based on majority. And we respect the freedom of people to live their lives broadly. Obviously, these are very simplified descriptions, and there are constraints, but that for me is what democracy is.
Bob, there are countries like North Korea, for instance, which officially calls itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. They also hold their elections, for example, and amazingly, they had a 99% turnout during their last election. Um, how do we differentiate these democracy from a liberal democracy, for example?
Yeah. So let's take the three ideas, right? Equality, majority rule, and that you have freedoms. So in North Korea, obviously, the concept of individual freedoms is not just limited, it is highly constrained. You cannot, if you are a North Korean, travel easily to another country. Can you go out into the streets and express your discontent at the government? Likely not. So the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech is highly curtailed, which is among the, shall we say, the most tangible and most important parts of democratic expression. The second is majority rule. They claim majority rule, but it's actually decided by a very small clique of leaders, very small factions, who are selected not based on a popular vote, or if it is a popular vote, it is a popular vote that is constrained. In other words, you could have a popular vote, but if you say only people with the surnames ending in J can run for office, and then you make sure that everyone has no surname involving J except you and the members of your family, then yes, there might be voting, but you limit the political space for the expression of freedom of choice. You limit the political space in which people can equally participate, not only as voters, but eventually in governing the country, right? Like you, if you want to become a politician subject to constraints of money and maybe your own time, you could put your name on a ballot, right? When you reach the appropriate age, decide to run either for a local position, a national position, or even for president, subject to reasonable limitations. In Korea, North Korea to be precise, those limitations are what you would consider as not reasonable. They are severely skewed towards a ruling faction or even a ruling individual and his family.
That's interesting, Bob. I wonder why they still call themselves a democracy despite the contradictions that you mentioned. Does the idea of a democracy give a sense of legitimization to their rule?
Yes, you do that, right? You call things like people would say the Philippines is not a fully functioning democracy, right? You have heard that criticism that our country does not fully function as a democracy. It still calls itself a democracy. It has a lot of characteristics that are part of democracies. So, the name that you give yourself does not connote that you are that thing. It is
Yeah.
partly to sell the idea, it is partly to sell the idea to people, but the name does not decide anything. It is the characteristics of the system.
It's interesting, Bob, that you've mentioned that perhaps there's a hierarchy on what we consider to be the top, um, like, descriptor of what a democracy is. And my next question really is, we've seen or heard of the term democracy in literature since, perhaps tracing back to the ancient Athens. If really there's a thread of democracies back then, and then what we have right now in our representative systems, what would you say is that thread connecting Athens and then what we have right now?
It is that sovereignty resides in the people, right? The people get to choose what happens to them. Now, for sovereignty, for people to exercise that sovereignty, they must have certain freedoms. The freedom to speak, right? Because how can people say we choose what is going to happen to our country if they cannot discuss, debate, and complain about what is happening? And then the second one, so that you have sort of the sovereignty resides in the people. Then you have give them the ability to exercise their freedoms, to discuss what they want. And then finally, you have to make a decision. We have 3 or 4 ideas on the table. How do people choose which one? Is it left to 5 people who will say, no, I agree with you, but I don't agree with you? No, it's not like that. Then we go to the concept of majority rule, which is people will then vote, maybe directly on a measure, or more likely or more commonly as it is today, vote through representatives that they elect. So I think the common thread that runs through that is the people are sovereign, they make their choices, and how the system is developed for them to effectively make those choices in a manner that is free and, shall we say, where each individual gets the same rights is the essence of democracy that runs through this.
Now, many Filipinos in recent years have actually lamented that we have gained, quote unquote, too much freedom at the expense of order. And perhaps that is the main reason that some of us use to justify our election of strong men who are willing to push our safeguards to our limits. Unfortunately, at the expense of human rights and individual freedom. Now, is it correct to say that there is an inherent tension between liberalism and democracy?
No, okay. If you talk about liberalism, right, it is that there are institutional checks
Mm.
on freedom of behavior. There are checks, whether it's principles or institutions, on our ability to act. And we put in those checks because we would like to protect other principles that are just as important. Okay, so
Mm.
going to making your question much, much more concrete. The problem we have in the Philippines, and which is why many people say they want strongmen, is actually not so much a problem of democracy. It is a problem of how our institutions have functioned. Our democratic institutions have not functioned well. So the checks and balances that people would like to see, the
Mhm.
practical ability of the police to stop crime is compromised because of corruption. Well, you can give that as one example. So I'll give an example, right? So people complain that there is too much freedom. Now, there are two ways you can look at this. One is that people are free to do what they would like to do, even if this is illegal, right? So that actually is not too much freedom. It is a problem of enforcement, which is a problem of institutions, right? So sometimes people conflate the two. So if you see people gambling away in the streets when it should be illegal, or getting drunk on the streets, or committing crimes on the streets in plain view, that is not a problem of freedom, because our principles of freedom say you cannot commit crimes, right? It has nothing to do with the idea of freedom. It is more
Right.
the ability of the institutions, of our courts, of our police to function. Then there is the other one, which is probably closer to the cultural thing, right? People say, okay, and we can go and these are really, shall we say, deeply fought ideas. We are a conservative Christian country, and for us, divorce is not allowed, right? So some
Right.
people would say, we want the freedom to divorce. Some people would say, no, that is too much. That goes against our core ideas or principles as a majority Christian country, right? So this goes less to the enforcement and to the question of what is really freedom in this context? What are the reasonable constraints on the freedom to marry? Or if you want to undo your marriage, undo your marriage. So that is one of the, shall we say, more difficult questions in terms of, for many countries, how to balance things. Now, many countries have divorce. They've allowed that because they've decided, okay, the majority of people want that. It is something that does not go against our cultural beliefs, or, we believe that the freedoms should be protected. There are some countries that say we will put more restrictions on the ability to divorce or to undo marriages. And that's a societal decision. So that's sometimes where people also say, oh, there's too much freedom, right? They say there's too much freedom culturally. And that's where you get right now, which is a very, very difficult topic, into the culture wars, right? I'll give you an example of freedom to migrate, right? There is the freedom to allow people in, to let them live in your societies, give them a path to citizenship. That is one freedom that is granted by many countries. Some people will say, we've been too liberal. Foreigners should not have a path to citizenship. Foreigners should not be allowed to own real estate. Foreigners should do this, etc., etc. And then sometimes then the country starts moving or becoming too illiberal in that regard. So I think the question of liberality, illiberality in our case, many times I think in the discussions in the Philippines get conflated with legality and illegality, which for me is a non-issue. It is not. We are not becoming too liberal when you see people getting drunk on the streets. It's illegal. Or when you see people, well, maybe it's not illegal to get, or like, let's say, committing crimes on the streets. It is not. That's not a problem of liberality versus illiberality. The big question are sometimes the changes in the social norms, where we get all these challenges, and there are a lot of them.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it seems overwhelming whenever we talk about it. But in the context of institutions, for example, what can we do about it? Because it seems like reforming our institutions is a much easier task than really changing our cultural norms with regards to freedom. For example, for same-sex couples to be married, for example, or for women to have abortion. What reforms can we do with our institutions, for example? Or is it also related to the cultural notion of um of reforming corruption, for example, in our institutions? Because for example, the dominant discourse with regards to corruption, for example, within our institutions, is that it's inherently cultural, that Filipinos are prone to corruption culturally, that we are naturally corrupt, for example. Is that true?
No. I have a friend. He has a phrase I have adopted, which is the explanation of culture is the repository of our ignorance. When we do not understand something, we just say, "Oh, it's our culture," and then we push it under the rug or into the
Yeah.
drawer in the belief that we can change it. I do not agree with that. So that's why I say, when people say that, I say no. We are expressing our ignorance in that we are either unwilling or unable to understand something, and therefore we look for the shorthand of culture as an explanation. Culture is simply group behavior based on incentives, based on history, based on certain, shall we say, learned aspects, right? Which is and when we learn something, it's a function of the information we get. It's a function of the incentives we have. All these different things.
Right.
So for me, saying it is culture is sort of a shortcut to avoiding the real question of what can we do, what was the cause, and how do we change things.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
so going to your question, for me, a society is not simply about principles. It is about people. It is about community. People feel good in the society if they can live meaningful lives. And the definition of a meaningful life, and this goes to the concept of individual freedoms, is we decide what a meaningful life is, right? Someone might want to become an engineer and just say, I want to do it because I want to do the science of engineering. Someone might want to become a popular actor or actress, and some people might say, oh, that's a empty career, but some people might say, no, to each his own, whatever makes you live a meaningful life. So that means there must be freedom for people to live meaningful lives. But at the same time, we also live in a community. As a community, we evolve norms of behavior, right? So, and some of these norms are like, you've seen that in some cities, right? Why is Airbnb struggling in some cities? Because sometimes, you convert an apartment building or an apartment unit into an Airbnb rental. It becomes very noisy. And people who are used to living and saying, oh, we all go to sleep at 10, 11, not too much noise, suddenly their quality of life is severely impacted. Now, is it illegal? Is it economically, shall we say, beneficial to rent out an apartment? Yes, right? Because if you rent out an apartment, you make money as an individual, which you can probably spend for your family or invest in more things, which lead to productive gains. But at the same time, you are running against the community sort of tradition, which is, we've lived here all our life. We're getting used to sleeping at 9 or 10. Therefore, it's not only the fact that we can sleep, certain aspects or norms of the community are being violated. So you then get that conflict. And that's where a lot of the conflict arises. It is when we do not take into account community norms. And arriving at those community norms is another part of democracy, which is people should be able to express and talk and arrive at a compromise, which is, for me, is the essential function of politics, actually. When people say there's too much politics, they almost say, like, why can't we just get things done and, not discuss and dabble in political discussions? But for me, politics is a very important process because we all have different aspirations. Things change. We all want to do different things, maybe in different ways, right? Let's say, I'll give you an example, a resort island like Boracay or beautiful island. Some people would say, no, let's keep them as they are, pristine, untouched, safe. And then a local resident will say, why are you in Manila able to become rich by building all these condos while we in Boracay or in Palawan, you restrict to building only small, shall we say, resorts that only earn a little bit of money when we can build a 5-story condo that would probably earn a lot more. But then we in Manila say, but we need to protect the environment. For whose benefit? Yours or ours? So there are all these difficult debates in weighing community priorities. And that's where we get a lot of the conflict. And effective politics and effective leadership in a democracy is how we arrive at a compromise that sort of keeps the community together despite these different principles. It is much more difficult than most people understand, because you might come from Manila. Your priorities might be different from somebody who comes from the southern islands of the Philippines. Mindanao, less developed, less wealthy. So how do we match those? And that is where politics and democratic principles come in, because everyone must be able to speak. Everyone must be able to vote. But at the same time, we have to protect interest of the minority who sometimes might lose out but we have to make sure that they are protected based on certain principles. That's the concept of liberal democracy.
There's a lot to unpack from what you said, Bob. But two things. First is you mentioned incentives. Actually, last week, Jam and I were talking about um, a very basic Filipino behavior, which is that a lot of Filipinos throw their trash outside. So they throw trash on the streets, for example. And right, Jam, we were talking about it because it's easy to identify it as a Filipino thing. Like it's part of our
Mhm.
culture that we're naturally careless about our waste, so we just throw them around, for example. But we were arguing about it last week, right, Jam? Since we think that it's not really a matter of cultural, it's not a matter of culture, but more of really incentives and rules that govern our waste practices, for example. Because there are no there are no strong rules regarding waste segregation, for example. So people are not incentivized really to properly segregate their waste, for example. You're not going to be caught, for example. You're not going to be fined for throwing your trash on the street, for example. So really, there are no incentives, there are no rules. So people are quote unquote free to do what they want, but in reality, just like what you said, it's a violation of the laws. So
Mhm.
the bigger issue really is that how are we going to enforce these laws, as what you said. Now, and the second point, with regard to what you said about reaching a compromise in a democracy, the importance of debates, for example, in weighing conflicting interests, because we have different interest groups, for example, we have groups that have different aspirations, like what you have said. Um, I was reading a chapter by Dr. Ulfabella on capitalism and inclusion under weak institutions. So this is his book. Um, and he discussed precisely this dilemma of liberal democracies such as the Philippines in terms of state decision making. He discussed the concept of Arrow's impossibility theorem, wherein a state has to cater conflicting interests. So of course, he will undergo debates, deliberations in order to reach a compromise. But the problem with states like the Philippines, for example, is that our state, our government is trying to cater to these conflicting interests to the point that it becomes paralyzed to really make a conclusive political action. Um, for example, in terms of our public projects, since of course the government will inevitably face opposition from in one way or another, it's always at the risk of encountering a lot of delays in terms of making big changes, making big political and policy changes. What can you say about that dilemma?
That is a going to your second question first. We'll first tackle the garbage. Like, why do people throw garbage outside their houses or into the streets? Okay, so going on to the second, that is a problem in democracies everywhere, right? That is why you see in many countries there are complaints about, like Japan, economic policy. They had this what you might call the lost decade, right, where they kept on figuring out how to get out of deflationary trap, etc. That is a big problem for Japan. Other countries have these kinds of coordination problems, and I think that is one of the things you take with democracy, that there is a lot of, shall we say, debate inside. There are powerful vested interests that will try to influence the process both openly and not so openly. And because of that, you will have inefficiencies. The opposite side is, you might say, okay, then there are inefficiencies in the decision making process. Therefore, let's make the decision maker stronger, somebody who can decide quickly. The risk with that is, for every, shall we say, good, strong leader such as Lee Kuan Yew, you get dozens of strong men who eventually fall to making decisions based only on their own interests or on perpetuating political power. So that is really a challenge that we continue to address as democracies. Have we found the perfect solution? No. But again, I think we go back to the core idea. If only politicians would start thinking, I preside over a community with different interests. So if let's turn it into a much more specific example. When you and your friends try to make decisions, sometimes you can get paralyzed, right? Into because no one
Right.
wants anything and you can't have a majority. Whether it's a place where to eat, what to watch, where to go on vacation, right? And you get paralyzed to the point where suddenly the opportunity disappears, right? It suddenly, everyone just decides to go their own way. So one of the things I've found that in communities, what makes the process of compromise credible is the promise that if your interest is sort of compromised now, let's say somebody says, okay, we'll do this, but in the future, we'll do the process again, and maybe we might listen to some of your other suggestions. In the meantime, can you talk to your other friends and convince them that, in another decision, it would be better to adopt this framework or this policy? In other words, one of the ways in which we can remove that constraint or reduce that constraint of people sort of hunkering down into their individual silos and into their individual corners is if I compromise today, the system will allow me to get a better compromise tomorrow, but I have to work with other people to convince them that my ideas are actually good and workable. And the system will reflect or sort of respect that if I'm able to get more people on my side, they will respect the decision that I am able to elicit. So let's say, just to prolong the debate, let's say today you want Chinese food. But the majority of your friends want Indian, Italian, etc. Then you say, okay, I may like Chinese food a lot, but I know that next week is going to be one friend's birthday and she likes Italian, and I'll lobby that we go Italian instead, or we'll go Chinese, right? So this week you agree, okay, I may not like Italian food, I may like the Chinese food, but I enjoy the company of my friend, so I'll agree that we go Italian. But I know next week is another friend's birthday and she likes Chinese, and I'll lobby for Chinese. And you know that when you lobby for Chinese and everyone agrees with Chinese, you will go Chinese, right? It's not like suddenly we'll say, oh, Cesar, got his way, we're all going to leave and just eat what we'd like. Because in that case, what will happen? Your friendships will start to fray. It is the same with societies. The ability of societies to respect compromises and to observe future compromises is critical to this process of people accepting compromises and simply saying, okay, we'll do this now, then let's talk about other things, let's agree. Okay, so at the end of the day, your job, you then recognize that there is a process that is predictable in the whole thing, which is I agree to this compromise, I'll work on my other friends, or in the community, I'll work on other voters so that they'll recognize my point of view, and maybe I can move another decision in the way I'd like it in the future, and they will respect that decision. So for me, that is sort of the predictability of the compromise process in politics is very important, because once you lose the predictability of the compromise process, then people start going into their own individual silos. We become binary in our thinking. If I don't win this today, I will not win again tomorrow. So everyone goes into, I have to win today because there's no promise I can win tomorrow. Or even if I win tomorrow, that the other side will recognize my victory, right? That's the problem with coups, right? That's why we have coup d'etats, right? The military says we don't recognize this process. We don't recognize this. So that is one of the problems. Now, going to your next question about why we throw trash in the streets. So again, this goes into my concept of, it's also the same thing, right? Several years ago, somebody asked me, why do jeepney drivers block the intersection, right? You've seen this, or even not jeepney drivers, cars, right? It's very obvious that they have nowhere to go on the other side of the street. They go to the middle to block everyone. Why don't they look at the responsibility of keeping the intersection open? Now, no one has unfortunately done a focus group interview on behavior in crowded, or shall we say, at intersections, but just theorizing the thought process of many people. And what is their thought process? That other person is not going to give way. Like if I open up, if I get into an intersection that is busy, and uh, I don't push forward the other guy on the perpendicular part of the street, the one, if I'm this way and the other person here, he's going to be the one to block it and I will lose out. Right?
Right.
That is almost the thinking. It's almost like it's every person for himself. It is it is like uh, my priorities, because again, I do not recognize that you will respect rules, that you will respect shared norms of
Right.
behavior. Uh, the first time I traveled to Germany, uh, I was traveling in the Philippines. When 20 years ago, when you just start learning to drive, you will recognize one behavior, which is when you approach an intersection, you slow down. And why do you slow down? Because there is no concept of a through street in the Philippines, right?
Right.
You don't know if the next person coming to that same intersection will go forward and you hit each other. So you slow down to gauge the intent of the person coming from the perpendicular side of the street. I was in Germany, and I was on the passenger side. I would step on the brakes every time we approach sort of the entrance from the side to the expressway. Because why? I was used to slowing down because I didn't know whether the person
Yeah.
on coming in
Right.
would go in at the right speed and avoid me. In Germany, they had evolved the behavior that the way to avoid accidents was maintain a constant speed. You come in, you either beat the speed of the person who's coming in. In other words, there are norms of behavior on how to drive when entering an expressway or when approaching an intersection, in which case there's a through street. So norms of behavior are very important. In the Philippines, those norms of behavior have been compromised many times by economic inequality. Like, the jeepney driver. Ask once a jeepney driver, why does he block it? Because if he doesn't block it, or if he doesn't stop at the corner, he loses his fare, which is
Right.
essential maybe for the survival of his family. And then I ask him, but isn't that, are you not compromising other people, right? You're blocking other people, or you're not moving from the intersection when it's a go, and therefore blocking people from behind. And he said, it's a dog eat dog world.
Yeah.
If you don't do it, you don't survive. So sometimes our inability to see these behavioral aspects of decisions and address the cause of the behavioral aspect is at the root of it all. So it's not just simply enforcement. It is because if, let us say, you're a jeepney driver, and sorry to belabor the point, if you're a driver of a vehicle, and for those unfamiliar, the jeepney is the most popular low-cost form of transportation in the Philippines, used by the lowest income earners. And jeepney drivers, as a consequence, don't earn that much. They're also on the borderline of the lowest income groups in the Philippines. So for them, losing a few people a day consistently at every intersection adds up, which is the difference between them being able to have enough money for that day or not having enough money for that day. So for them, the incentive, because of high levels of poverty and inequality, is to extract as much value. And then they say, why should I follow the rules when other people don't follow the rules? And they can point to other things, whether it's government, etc., etc. So for me, going back to your question of why do people throw out into the streets? Because there is no shared ownership of the community, because there is a belief that I protect what is my own, but other than that, I leave it to others to protect themselves. And therefore, if you will notice, if you go to some parts of the Philippines, like in the provinces, where people have lived together longer and know each other and know who throws out trash, you will notice that there is less trash actually than in the major urban areas. Why? Because they know each other in the community, they have shared values, they see themselves as a community, and if they don't do it, no one else will. So there's a sort of a community effort behind it. But I agree also that you need enforcement, and that goes to the other failing that we have, which is, as I discussed earlier in the talk, which is
Right.
our institutions are not functioning. And you can discuss corruption, you can discuss lack of budgetary priorities, you can discuss a range of other things for why our system doesn't function as it should. But there's also the community aspect of it.
It's really interesting, Bob, that you've mentioned all of this. And I'm reminded of a crucial concept, perhaps, in discussion of democracy, which is I read the book of Karl Popper, Open Society and Its Enemies, and there he introduces the concept of the paradox of freedom, where there's really so you have institutions and norms that, in a way, bolster the individual freedoms of people, but there are also maligned agents who will paradoxically use the same freedoms, but to instill or to somehow counteract those freedoms that he or she is using. So one way to view this is perhaps in the culture wars of America, the Democrats are saying that Republicans are the very fabric of ideology of Republicans are anti-democratic. Like for example, when they say um, immigrants are not allowed, they're saying that America is becoming less and less diverse, which is also a central feature of American democracy. So perhaps there's this sorts of debates ongoing, and they're saying that, of course, depending on which party you're on, you're gonna claim that the other party is abusing their freedom, and then incubating these ideas that are leading to more illiberalism or anti-democratic ideas. My question then is, how do you even filter this, or like, is there a way to um, identify them and then filter them? I mean, especially in the age of social media, AI, disinformation, all of this. Maybe I just wanted to get your thoughts
When you
on
say
this.
filter them, what filter what in what regard?
Just more like maybe identify, and then how do you even begin to see which ideas are threatening democracies, and then how then do you make policies around that? Like one way, since I'm also involved in media and democracy conversations, they say, of course, self content regulation by Meta is one way of filtering ideas. Like when you post radical ideas, extremist ideas on Meta, for example, you will get flagged. Are there steps for the government to perhaps augment that identification part of which ideas are threatening democracy, and then which policies are then should be enacted? I'm sorry if it doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
That's
no, I am a bit skeptical of censorship. Okay, I'm very skeptical that there is an informed class who will decide what information is should not be published or published. Okay, because
Mhm.
I'll give you say you've seen if you go to Google News that there are these fact checkers, right?
mhm,
Sometimes you see that about it is impossible to fact check every single piece of information that comes
yeah.
out of the social media, regular media, etc. It is in my opinion, it is a misleading process. Okay, Snopes is a very useful thing, right? If you personally want to check something and find out if it's an urban legend or not, right? But it depends on your willingness to check that, and most people do not have the time or
Right.
willingness to check facts, and therefore sometimes people say, then let's put it at the hands of the large social media companies. I'm a bit hesitant to do that because again, it might be a false. It might give you false hope that every piece of misinformation can be flagged, right? Because the danger
Mhm.
is if you give the impression that every piece of false information can be flagged, then any information that gets through these sort of filters should then be treated as real, which only gives the other side more reason to game the system,
Mhm.
right? So the challenge is if you create and say we have met the standard for flagging false information and therefore all the information that is not flagged is valid, then that creates a dangerous belief where, oh, okay, I saw this, it was not flagged, therefore it must be true. Okay, that's the danger. For me, you are probably all too young to remember a time before social media. But 30 or 40 years ago, if something came out, you would first say, okay, I'll check other things. I'll check the newspapers. Or ideas that were, you might say, one sided were debated in media or social media or by institutions, right? You could claim it could be the academe, it could be the church, it could be NGOs, social interest groups. At the end of the day, you'd come out and say, okay, this idea is good if we do it this way, but if we do it another way, it might not work so well. And we have to protect some of the people who might become vulnerable if we implement this idea, right? Let's just say something like import liberalization, right? If you want to liberalize imports, that's good because you improve trade. But at the same time, if you liberalize imports, there is a sector in the economy that will suffer. So you the
Mhm.
sort of the informed debate would be, okay, we want to liberalize imports because we'd like to bring in these commodities so people can afford them at a lower price, which is good. Because if you're a consumer, you'd want to say, I don't want to subsidize somebody who is inefficient and producing things badly. But at the same time, you say, but these people have employees. These people have, they tried their best, but it wasn't working. Why don't we give them some time to transition to a new job? And in which case, therefore, the liberalization should be accompanied by training of workers. It should be accompanied maybe by a grace period, shall we say, a period in which there's a transition for the local manufacturer. So maybe he can invest his capital in something else. Now, that is also prone to abuse, but at least you're thinking of the whole thing, right? It's not a binary formulation of liberalize or not. No, it's liberalize, but do other things. Let's weigh the cost. Let's find out the benefit. At the end of the day, let's come up with a set of policies that help the consumer, but at the same time, give the local manufacturer who is hurt by liberalization a fair chance and their workers a fair chance, right? And that is a framework in itself on how to solve these problems. The problem right now with media, social media, and the flow of information is that this debate gets lost in the, you don't want liberalization, but are you a protectionist, concern, all these things, right? Instead of saying, no, there is a debate. There are different aspects of this debate that have to be discussed, not by people who just had 10 minutes to look at it and say, oh, everyone, and then everyone chimes in, and it's all of that, right? So I believe the answer is really, it's not censorship. It is strengthening institutions that engage in this kind of debate, discussions, and sort of dissemination of ideas in a non-binary format. Right, in a way that does not say everyone who disagrees with liberalization is a communist. Everyone who wants some form of increased taxes so we can maybe help some people is a socialist, etc. It's when we put debate into these binary formulations that we start losing that these are complicated issues. These are complicated systems. So going to your question on this, if I were the government, if I were private companies, I would actually start going and saying, how do we strengthen institutions that foster thoughtful, reasonable debate, which I hope we are part of right now. Okay. And therefore get it out to the most people. The challenge is 30 years ago, you could do that, right? Because you woke up, you watched the news. There were 3 or 4 TV channels 30 years ago. There were 2 or 3 newspapers. They'd all bounce around an idea. And maybe at the end of the day, you'd say, yeah, I understand. There are different aspects of this. Right now, social media, basically, one issue is 30 minutes, everyone piles on based on a binary formulation. And then suddenly everyone becomes an enemy or a friend because of this. And then they say, no, that was an enemy earlier. That is what's unfortunately social media and the number of channels for information has created for us. And we have not yet adapted our systems to that. Maybe 10, 15 years from now, there will be a system. But right now, we are still there where social media and media prey on our confirmation biases. Our willingness to put ourselves into holes or into silos because somebody agrees with us rather than thinking, if everyone agrees with me, there's something wrong. In fact, that's how I approach consuming media and social media. If everything I see agrees with me, it's not because I'm right. It's because an algorithm is telling me this is the stuff I want to see. Therefore, if I start seeing that people agree with me, I become very suspicious.
And the problem is, Bob, people's attention spans are too low today that people would rather settle for short slogans rather than really looking into the nuances of a particular socioeconomic issue.
Yeah,
So it's
and not only that, it's not only the attention span, it is the cost of information, right? You and I assume that you have unlimited internet, right? That you can go on the internet any day, any point of the day, whether you're in your car, whether you're at home. The vast majority of our countrymen have limited access to internet, right? And it's not just a question of access, it's a question of ability. You can use ChatGPT, but you probably are not as efficient in ChatGPT as some of the best ChatGPT people in the world, right? Imagine the ability of a farmer of a
Right.
service worker who did not have your education, who does not have the access to the internet that you have, the access to ChatGPT that you have.
Yeah.
They come in here and they only have it's a cost to them. They spend hours commuting on the road. And then we ask them, why don't you look at all the 20 senatorial candidates, weigh them, and this is
Right.
running ahead maybe of the topic, and say,
Mm.
hey, I'll choose the best senatorial candidate. I can, it's like me asking you, Cesar, there are four types of batteries for EVs. Let's say, solid, etc., etc. Solid state. There's lithium ion. There might be alternative non-internal combustion engines. I'll ask you, Cesar. Here's $10 million. Can you invest on the best one within the next 5 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
I'll ask you to invest, and you say, I have no idea. I have to research each one because I know little about it. I am a lawyer. I know a lot of stuff. But if you ask me to even change a light bulb in my house, I will struggle. So we are
Mm-hmm.
not experts in everything. We need to gather information, and information gathering is costly. And for the vast majority of our people, it is
Yeah.
not only costly in terms of access to information, it is costly in terms of their time. And sometimes they've lost access to unbiased media information, media that is not paid for, media that has not already been, shall we say, compromised by vested interests. So if you are standing out there and you put yourself in the position of a low income earner in the Philippines, your ability to even chime in objectively is compromised, not by your own choice, but by the circumstances you're in. Therefore, you will revert to confirmation bias, which is, or worse, you will follow somebody who you believe is an expert, but in reality is not, and was manipulated their profile to make them appear as experts.
I would just like to give a comment regarding our access to the internet. It's a really good observation, I would say. Because personally I experienced living in Australia for 2 years. So I recently came back here, and when I was there, their news was the government was phasing out their 3G. So the entire Australian continent will bid goodbye to 3G. And when I came back here, and I opened my data, I had LTE.
Mhm.
I only had LTE. So I guess the discourse really is different when you're living in rich countries like Australia, in contrast to when you're living in the Philippines. When the reality is, majority of our people still don't have stable access to the internet, for example, and it really poses a huge challenge to the changes that we are experiencing as a democracy in terms of disinformation. Um, I think yesterday there were two circulating videos, or there was a video featuring a young student talking about the
Mm.
Duterte and the impeachment. And when I look at it, I wasn't really thinking that the video was AI generated, but apparently it was.
Mhm.
Because it looks so good. It looks
Mm.
so normal, and it's quite sinister. It's quite I think it's gonna cause a lot of anxiety for many of us, because even I, who's specializing in digital media research, for example, I do encounter difficulty in identifying which is which. And when I'm thinking about other Filipinos who don't really have the experience, or enough immersion into these technologies, uh, I think our democracy really will face greater challenges in the coming months or in the coming years with these technologies.
I totally agree. And just to add a couple of more thoughts on that. So you are able to spot AI deepfakes because you have some idea of the indicators of deepfakes, right? Whether it
Right.
is there's misleading information, there's something disjointed in the appearance of the deepfake, or it just contradicts something you've known for some time and you're wondering how maybe I'll just do a look into who this person is and see if they really exist or not. So you had different tools. You had your intelligence, which was formed by a decent, good education. You have access to the internet. You had access to post education, shall we say, training. You had all these things that were available to you, right? So the question is, how do we replicate you with humanity, right? With all people. And the challenge is, therefore, the rest of the country must have the same resources that you have, which is a really huge challenge. So, if you take a look at somebody growing up in a barangay in a rural area, let's say right now, grade 5, grade 6, right? They suffered through the first years of the pandemic. Their math skills are probably much, much regressed compared to where you were when you were grade 5 or 6. And their math skills allow them to understand statistics, allows them to understand when something is an outlier, when something looks weird, when there's bias. So they already lack that critical ability. And then they will go through life, probably, if they're lucky, they get the scholarship, but otherwise, if they are low income, their ability to access the internet, to buy the post education training that you have is much weaker. So yes, I agree with you. So for me, the solution is backwards. We have to invest in two things: into the abilities of our people and into the institutions that can say, you know what, we're able to do this. We can weigh different things and say, like an NGO or a business organization or even a media, and say, you know what, A says this. The problem with doing A is it will lead to these bad outcomes. B says this. B also has bad outcomes. How do we compromise? We don't. That is a very weak part of our discussion nowadays. And unless we improve that, there are two ways this will happen. And sorry to belabor this point. If you get so inundated with false information that you don't know what is real or not, there are two ways you can decide it as a human being. The first way is to say, okay, I'm going to shut down my Facebook. I'm going to shut down social media because it's not reliable. I will look for the reliable sources of information. I will talk to my friends. I will talk to people who know better. That's one way. Or at least I will check, right? If you see something on YouTube, you first check, is it on CNN? Is it on BBC? Is it an Inquirer? If it's not, then maybe it never happened, or maybe it's just too biased. Okay. You could do that. That requires information and that requires access. Or you say, you know what, the world is too uncomfortable. Because I can't figure out what, I'll just trust the people who I trust. And these might lead you to confirmation bias as well. So, yes, the future is highly uncertain. There might be a future for media organizations still. That's my belief. If people say, at the end of the day, I don't understand what's happening with the world, it's just too, shall we say, there's just too much unreliable information, then I look to the reliable sources. The problem is, determining what reliable sources are can be vulnerable to either confirmation bias, or maybe at the end of the day, people will find it. But it's a very uncertain question.
I would say in the Philippines, this is where really the discourse of the cost of information really is perfectly consummated is our elections. We just recently had our midterm elections. And there's a study that said that the term bobotante, in English, stupid voters or ignorant voters, or has recently, it peaked in 2019, and then it continuously it plateaus until today. So it means that a lot of people really designate people who do not agree with their political options as ignorant or as stupid or as, all these things. Um, it reveals two things. It reveals that there's, of course, like what you're saying, there's an incubation, there's a bubble that foster, polarization, meaning there's a certain group of people just believing the same thing, confirmation bias, etc. But it also speaks of the perhaps the vitriol or the hatred or the contempt for other people, and the lack of empathy, perhaps, is this is a perfect way to put it. And you said, of course, listening to what you've said in the past few minutes, this is, of course, a flawed thinking too, because of course there's a lot of barriers to information. But this kind of discourse is happening. I mean, it's a legitimate thing that we're facing, and it basically it moralizes, but at the same time it misdiagnoses what we're seeing as a matter of being rational or irrational. And in one of your columns, Bob, you said that you argued that instead of looking at it from that lens, we may be guided to look at voting in a more strategic way, as a strategic decision, I think is how you put it. I'd like to perhaps pickle your brain on this. What do you mean by strategic decision? Because immersed in this conversation, it's usually this other side says the other side are evil. You know, so what do you mean by strategic decision in this
Okay.
process?
When I mention strategic voting, many times people say there is this flawed belief, I think, that democracy is you go to the polling place, you go to your precinct on the day of elections, then you vote. You vote for the candidates you like or you believe in, and then democracy has been fulfilled, right? Because you've already voted, you've chosen your leader, and you hope that that leader or your representative will express or follow the principles that you believe they represent, right? So if somebody, let's say, believes in, shall we say, agriculture as a high priority, and you vote for this person as a senator or as a member of Congress, you hope that they will do that, right? Now, I think that is misleading in the sense that it assumes that our job as voters is simply to choose the best candidates we believe based on their alignment with our principles and then vote for them. But here is the question then, and this is why I say there must be strategic voting. Many times, as in society, the person you like might not be the one who is likely to win because of different reasons. They didn't run a good campaign. They didn't have the resources to run a good campaign. They might not have connected well with voters on other issues. So they are, if you're voting for 12 senators or there are 12 senators and your senator is number 20 and you vote for number 20, most likely he will not win. It is highly unlikely based on the surveys. And then you say, okay, yeah, I fulfilled my goal of voting for the person I like, but at the end of the day, that person is not going in. Therefore, the person who might get in is somebody who might be worse than him or her, and that person, therefore, is somebody you would like to keep out of office, right? So you would vote for somebody who has a better chance of beating that person. Let me explain it in a much more tangible way. Again, going back to the restaurant, right? Let's say you like Chinese. Another friend likes Japanese. Another friend likes Italian. And another friend likes American, right? There are four of you. Now, if you always say, I like Chinese, I like Chinese, at the end of the day, your three other friends might say, you know what? None of us like Chinese as much as he likes Chinese. So let's all agree, the three of us, one day will go Italian, American, Japanese. But this annoying guy, let's keep out the Chinese because we really do not like Chinese food. So at the end of the day, you lose out, right? Because you don't vote strategically. But if you vote strategically, you would say, hey, John, you like American? Okay, I'll agree with you, American. Next week, let's do Japanese. So by giving up something that you like, you actually might get it in the future, right? So it's the same thing with voting. We need more information to vote strategically. We have to keep out candidates who we believe can do more harm if our initial choice does not appear to have a good chance of winning. Now, this poses a conundrum, right? Or two seeming paradoxes. The first is, how do you know who's going to win or not win, right? If you saw in the Philippine elections recently, two candidates that you would consider as probably being weak, Bam Aquino, and Pangilinan did really, really well, okay? And the surveys did not capture that. So if you did not vote for Aquino, then he might have lost, right? So strategic voting could have, if you liked Aquino or if you like Pangilinan, strategic voting could have led to a worse outcome for you, because then you would have chosen somebody, in the 13, 14, which I think one of them was not in the 13th to 14th. If you, assuming you like this candidate, let's just go on that assumption without saying that they are the right or wrong candidates, right? So one challenge is acquiring the information to make a really strategic vote is difficult. The second thing is this. Strategic voting to a certain extent requires groups or institutions to function well. And again, I go to these institutions because I believe in institutions. Let's say you believe in three or four things. Yeah. Let's say you believe in the environment. You believe in solving EDSA traffic. You believe in good education for all. Let's say those are the three things that matter the most to you. Obviously, there are other things that will matter to you in your life. But let's say you believe that that's what's needed to have a good country: education, environment, and to a certain extent on a personal level, because you suffered traffic every day, you want traffic to be solved. So, is it possible to choose every single candidate who has consistently acted on these principles in a way that has delivered results? It's impossible. It is nearly impossible to do that because we don't know, right? I could give you a name of a senator and can ask you, do you know his voting record on traffic, his voting record on the environment, his voting record on the education? Did he really do it? Did he really coordinate with other senators to deliver that? Imagine doing that for one senator. Imagine trying to do that for 12 or 15 candidates. It is impossible. So how can you then vote strategically if you don't know which one is the right choice? And that is where groups come in. I used to live in the States. And, whether you agree with them or not, like there's the National Rifle Association, they effectively identify which candidates work best for their interest. This has nothing to do with they're right or wrong. They are very effective at doing it. The American Association for Retired Persons, the people who look after the interests of retirees, seniors, they do very well in saying these are the candidates that matter. We don't have that in the Philippines. It's a very weak process. If I cared about, shall we say, the environment and the protection of the oceans or the protection of the forests, has there been any strong organization that says we know who has worked for the protection of the forest and the environment? They have worked consistently throughout their lives. It is not just empty promises. They have passed bills. They have funded organizations. No, we don't. So it's very difficult. But strategic voting, going back to your initial question, is we have to choose who will deliver the best results based on what we know. It is not simply pie in the sky saying, I like this person because he's made these promises and he appears to be good. No, strategic is, what do I want at the end of the day? I may have to make some compromises and not vote for a good person I like, but who's number 40 right now and probably has a 5%, 2% chance of winning, versus somebody who maybe doesn't fulfill all my check boxes, but at the end of the day, I get 3 out of 5 things I like, rather than 0 out of 5, right? With a hypothetical aspirational candidate. So that, I hope, answers my question of strategic voting. I can give you another example of that. And this is my finally best example. I was once almost kicked out of a democracy forum because of this. This is my question. Let's say it's election day. You wake up at 10 a.m. In the Philippines elections, it's a holiday. You wake up at 10, you have breakfast, you have late lunch, you're a bit lazy, you watch something on Netflix, you watch the news, etc. At 4 o'clock, suddenly you decide, okay, I'm going to vote. You go to the polling place, there's a long line, and you end up like you're the second to the last voter in the line of your precinct. I ask people this: does your vote still matter? Yes or no? And most of them says, yes, it matters. Every vote matters. But I said 99.9% of people have already voted, right? You're the second to the last. So probably, let's say there are 30,000 precincts and there are 2 people, there's 60,000 voters. Your vote doesn't matter anymore for the presidency. Somebody has already won. So why not just go home? And they said, but if everyone thought that way, then no one would vote. So I said, answer that paradox, therefore. How do you know that your vote matters? Does the vote of the person who votes at 7 in the morning matter more than the person who votes at 5? No, right? It shouldn't. And that's the paradox, right? And I said, this is the answer to that. Your vote will matter if you're able to coordinate it with other people, or there are other people who think like you and you know how many they are roughly, right? So if you know that, this candidate is number 2 and I know there are lots of people voting for him, then I have to contribute my vote. Then the value of that vote goes up. But if there's no coordination and you're just hoping that this candidate wins, then yes, your vote is practically useless at 5:50. And let's say the precinct closes at 5. It's practically useless because you don't know how other people are voting and therefore are not able to cast your vote strategically. So information about how other people are voting is just as important, which is also why I don't like all these limitations on surveys. Okay, as long as the survey is correctly done and truthfully done, as close as it is to the vote, it's necessary so people can say, okay, I want this candidate, but doesn't look like he's gonna win, so I gotta find my next best candidate.
There's been a lot of conversations that we've been observing in FEF, but at the same time in our other commitments, that people are actually looking at the model of, they say, neo-authoritarianism, meaning leaders who possess authoritarian social um, dimensions to their policies, like their Lee Kuan Yew and perhaps Xi Jinping, but also pursue economic liberal reforms or ideas, right? Like Singapore, you could think of Singapore, you could think of China. And the question I have there is there a merit to that? I mean, it is economic liberalism, or does it always come with political liberalism? Or, you could pursue one and then leave the other, or perhaps prioritize one and then, you know.
No, the short answer is no, they do not have to come together, right? You could pursue economic liberalism without pursuing political liberalism as fully. And let's go, this is more to the practical meat and bones of it, right? If you pursue political liberalism without the correct institutional safeguards, and I mean just pure on like one person, one vote, everyone has an equal vote, majority rules, and there are limited institutional safeguards, then somebody who accrues economic power can actually distort the political system, right? They will start buying the ads that say, hey, let's follow this, even though it might be harmful politically for the system.
Right.
Because you can accrue economic power and translate that into political power. And if there are limited checks on the exercise of political power, then you can eventually distort the system to entrench your economic advantages. I'll give you an example. Do you know that in the US there's antitrust legislation, right? Antitrust legislation, as you understand it today, is to protect consumers from predatory practices by people who have, or by companies or entities that have market power, right? Maybe
Right.
to the extent where they can distort the system. Do you know that the origin of US antitrust legislation was not this? It was to reduce the ability of the big players to distort the political process and the political system by limiting their political power. It was not so much to limit their economic power of the consumer, it was to limit their ability to distort the political system, right? So, can we have, going to your question, can we have liberal economic principles with sort of more autocratic, let's not say authoritarian, but more control from the center? Yes, it is possible. They do not have to go together at the same time. In fact, if you liberalize economically and politically at the same time, coming from a very low base, your problem might be that the powerful economic interests will distort your political system. So what you need is a good political system that is able to sort of limit the ability of powerful economic interests, especially single economic interests, to distort the system. Now, people talk about Lee Kuan Yew. What they see in Lee Kuan Yew is, or in Singapore, is government doing things effectively, whether it is industrial policy, economic policy, or in just governance. And that is one of the aspects of governance, right? To solve problems, and we went into this earlier, you need to coordinate a response. And sometimes, if the system is not good at building compromises, if the system is weak at sort of coordinating an effective response, people say, if we cannot solve it among ourselves, let's choose someone who will tell us what to do. All right? You remember probably the Avengers movie where Loki said, "Is it not in your nature to be controlled?" There is a semblance of truth to that, because self-governance or governance by a community takes time. It takes effort.
Right.
It takes processes. It takes an investment into a whole lot of things. And sometimes people, when the system hasn't formed itself, it gets distorted, and people say, why not choose just somebody who can run things? But I said, for every Lee Kuan Yew who has done good things for a country like Singapore, history is littered with the corpses of autocrats who promised good things but ended up doing things only for themselves.
Despite these challenges that we are facing right now, why is democracy seen as the best form of government? And do you agree with that? And why should we still pursue liberal democracy if it is difficult and costly?
Because we all have aspirations to be better, right? And the only way to fulfill your aspiration to be better is if you have the freedom to pursue those aspirations. And probably no political system says the freedom to pursue aspirations not only requires the economic ability to act, but also the political ability to say, I disagree with where things are going, and I think we should do something in a different way. So it is, I think, part of having a meaningful life that you're able to do these things, to choose your path and to say to society, we are probably pursuing a wrong path and we need to go somewhere else better. So for me, democracy is, I haven't found a system that sort of holds that promise. The challenge for us as the Philippines is to develop the institutions and mechanisms by which we allow people to do that, right? So the first is how to allow people to make a choice as to what a meaningful life is for them. And that is for them to have, the resources to do that, whether it is education, health, just the ability to say, okay, I will have the tools to do it. You don't need a lot of money. I just want the ability to make a decision informed for myself, for my family. And I think, and that involves basic education, that being healthy at the start. So that is the first part of it. The second investment is into the institutions that make this a priority. Institutions that allow people to express themselves freely. Institutions that allow people to weigh in with measured, reasonable debate, not single line gotchas or single line polarizing arguments. So democracy requires a lot of investment. It is not just principles, it is not just ideas, but it is investment into the institutions, the processes, and the people that allow democracy to function effectively. And that's sometimes where we miss out in the Philippines. We have to keep asking the question, what are the pragmatic investments that we can make so we can have an informed electorate, an informed people, the ability of people to express themselves, to debate, to organize and gather if needed. And finally, the limit so that when people want to do this, they are not constrained, they're not censored, but at the same time, they are allowed to vote as they would like in as strategic as manner as they would like. So this is systematic. It's like, it is a very big systemic challenge. So, at the end of the day, these are the hard questions we must face. It is not simply, what is democracy? Democracy, people, one vote, one person. That's not it. That behind that one vote, one person is a whole system that allows that one vote, one person to be an expression of a meaningful choice. Not a choice na you just go there and you don't know who the three mayoral candidates are and you say, I'll just check one. It's like a random guess. No, that's not a meaningful choice. That is a choice, but it's not a meaningful choice. And don't be surprised if you see many people when they go down, as you know, in the elections, right? The senators are prominent, but the farther down they go into the local elections, the more I'll just check this box because somebody said he's a good guy without even knowing he's a good guy. So how do we make people have meaningful choices is the true challenge of democracy.
Wonderful. Thank you once again, Bob, for joining us today.
Sige, pleasure.